So we reached the equator of the World Championship match between Ding Liren and Gukesh with an amazing Game 7. Gukesh took the lead in this one and really put Ding against the ropes, but contrary to what I would have expected, Ding defended incredibly well. I thought he would have real trouble defending this inferior position, especially since he had problems in the last few rounds converting. I thought that psychologically it would be very difficult for Ding to face this defense after more or less squandering some chances in the previous game. But he did incredible. He really showed why he's the world champion still, and this match is wide open. So today we're going to take a look at some of the subtleties that Gukesh needed to find to win this game, because it wasn't easy at all. It's true that Gukesh had a really nice shot, but some of the things that he needed to find to take this one home were not easy at all, and we're going to try to understand them. So we're going to take the game from this position where, well, hell broke loose here. It's because Ding has a tough position ahead of him, even though this is supposed to be more or less equal. It's very hard to play with black. White has achieved this stability on the queen side, where black had this majority 3 against 2. But now the black pawns are not that mobile, and he enjoys Gukesh enjoys a nice pawn, nice pawn on d5, alongside this pair of bishops that can become pretty strong. And black has a problem, especially this knight on f8, that is kind of out of the game. With this maneuver of the bishop to d4, Gukesh neutralized black's best minor piece, this excellent dark square bishop, while at the same time he's not allowing any tricks with knight e6, putting the knight into play thanks to this edge race between the rook and the queen. And he's not allowing this because the bishop is on d4. Now Gukesh should just take the knight on e6. So the knight on f8 is relatively out of play at this point. And the thing is, Ding had sent it to that square, and it's very hard to go back. And the computer is suggesting knight a to d7. A very tough move to play for a human being. Just doing nothing. And, well, it seems pretty planless, but at the same time, it's also hard to find a way to improve the position with the white pieces. But the thing is, Ding, of course, as a human being, couldn't just sit there to wait. He took on e1. And after rook takes e1, he went for it. He took the pawn on a2, which is okay, but it's very risky. And the position gets very tough right away. Gukesh plays rook a1. And it has to be mentioned here that Ding was down to 17 minutes in this position, while Gukesh still had 44 minutes. Remember that this match is played without an increment till move 40. So Ding has to get to move 40 from this position only with 17 minutes on the clock. So he has to play extremely fast. We're at move 23. He still has to make 17 moves. Yes, 17 moves in 17 minutes. That's one move per minute in a, well, devilish position. This is a mess. And he kind of goes wrong immediately. It's not a big mistake. And it might seem like it's the only move. And queen b3 is so logical. It's the only square for the queen. But actually, he had to find c3 to more or less keep the balance, which is an incredible resource. Very tough to see it beforehand. And d5 is going to come under a lot of pressure in some of these variations. For example, after queen takes c3, black has this incredible resource. Knight takes d5. Sorry. Attacking the queen, freeing this diagonal for the bishop. Our queen is still hanging, but we have an equally strong threat. If white takes, this is the hard part, really, because if you just take bishop takes g7, wins the bishop, and that's it. That's just an extra piece for white. But black had to foresee bishop takes d4, attacking the queen again. So our queen is more or less invulnerable, at least we're fine. Black still needed to see this intermediate move. Bishop takes f7 check, because the bishop on d4 is falling anyway. Queen takes f7, knight takes d4. And after queen c4, he's more or less all right. And this is going to be a rather drawish position after the queens disappear. So that is just one variation that needed to be foreseen, because white doesn't even need to take with the queen. There was also bishop takes c3. But then this retreat queen c4 is quite strong. We have ideas such as knight takes d5, maybe knight e4, attacking the queen and freeing the bishop to attack the bishop on c3 too. In fact, after knight e3, which looks like a very normal idea, attacking the queen, defending the pawn on d5, black needed to foresee this move for any of these to make sense. Knight e4, attacking the queen. So if knight takes e4, knight takes d2, and the bishop's hanging, so knight takes d2, bishop takes e3, is definitely not enough for white. And what else? Well, after knight e4, if you take on e4, the queen is hanging. I mean, the knight could take that queen, but after queen takes e3, queen takes e3, bishop takes e3, rook takes a7, bishop takes b4, black was more or less alright. We could take this variation one step further because the knight might jump into h6, it's attacking f7 too alongside the rook. But after something like bishop d2, black would be alright. Of course, it was incredibly hard to calculate all of this, and Ding was down to 17 minutes on the clock. There was also queen d3, which is the engine's preferred move, which makes sense because there's no piece exposed on c3, so that there are no tricks with knight takes d5 any longer, but black can just play queen b3, and this is incredibly complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on here. If rook a3, queen b1, white even has to be careful where that king goes. Let's say he goes to g2, that's a mistake because of knight takes d5. And white's idea was to take so as to free the action of the queen against that rook, but this time knight f4 check is a discovered attack on the queen, so after g takes, rook takes d3, white would just lose the queen. That's the reason why after queen b1, the move was king h2, but still pretty messy after knight g4 check, h takes g, bishop takes d4, and white can't recapture without dropping the knight on c2, because knight takes d4, the queen falls. So after queen takes d4, queen takes c2, rook takes c3, white finally gets rid of that very dangerous passer, queen b2, and it might seem like white has a big advantage due to this passed pawn here, but not so much the case because the queen is so active. The queen is pinning this rook, attacking f2, always has an eye on f8, and this knight will be a reasonable blockader against it. So this position is still very, very complex. So Ding had very little time, and c3 is a move that you have to calculate extremely well for it to make sense, especially if you're so short on time. And Ding had foreseen queen b3 instead, which is still a fighting move, but the problem is the position is so hard to play for black. The queen is not getting trapped by so little, and the problem is that it's rather out of play. After check king g2, it was very, very hard to suggest a move for Ding here, so he just defended with rook d7, leaving the rook on a defended square. So for example, he could maybe think about some knight takes d5 at some point, and the rook would be defended by the knight on f8 in case the edge rays are meaningful at some point. But Gukesh spends quite a lot of time on this one. He spends 21 minutes, half of his remaining time on a Netzel move, this rook a5, attacking the pawn on b5, realizing that black doesn't have a lot of moves really. I mean, his pieces are kind of in a cage. This knight is never going back, and white is just going after black's pawns. The problem to make this move is just that there are so many options here. This is a very tough position because of the amount of reasonable looking moves, but the rook a5 keeps all the advantages while just threatening to take on b5. So queen b3 was played, rook back to a3. There's a repetition of moves here, queen b1, rook a5, and Ding plays queen b3 again, and now Gukesh plays for a win. He goes rook takes b5. And Ding had this in mind, queen d3, trying to exchange the queens and get counterplay with this passed pawn. But here is where the first big subtlety is missed by Gukesh, but it's just a very, very tough move to play. It's a quiet move that just that's just something that Stockfish should consider. Really, it's bishop e3. Bishop e3, it's an amazing move. And the whole point behind it is that white wants to take, and after c takes knight e1, and the pawn on d3 is gone. White is winning the pawn on d3. And if queen takes d2, bishop takes d2, this pawn is in huge trouble, and the problem for black is that his pieces are not active at all. The bishop is controlling this knight on f6 pretty well. d5 is very well defended. Knight e6 is never possible with that pawn on d5. And rook c5 is coming, stopping that pawn. The c4 pawn is basically condemned to falling. So the c4 pawn is basically gone after bishop e3. But it was very hard to foresee something like that. And everyone in all the transmissions, all the streams were suggesting queen f4, which is ultimately what Gukesh played. And makes a lot of sense. It attacks f6 right away. It stops the threat on the queen. And Ding played queen takes c2. The only blemish on queen f4, is that after bishop takes f6, there's this idea, queen f5, which Ding swiftly played to try to send this into an endgame. But it's going to be an incredibly tough endgame, both to win and defend. I don't even know who had a tougher time here. Of course, it's pretty awful to play with the black pieces because you can only survive. But at the same time, it feels like White's attacking chances were kind of reduced. But for sure, Gukesh remains way ahead here. And he goes immediately wrong with the most normal move ever, taking on f5. I mean, who wouldn't take and just allow g takes f5, or more like provoking it, because all the pawns are going to be weak after that. But to be real here, the thing is that the knight is getting out through g6, and Ding was probably happy about getting those double pawns because his knight is suddenly activated through g6 and then e5. Which goes to show that the position has to be considered as a whole. We have to evaluate weaknesses in their context, because what happens with this f5 pawn here is that, yeah, it's horrible. The structure for black is terrible, but the main problem for black was that this knight was completely out of play. And f5 is not going to fall immediately, while this maneuver is going to be very important for black to generate any chances at all. And in fact, this is a very nice subtlety that Gukesh had to find to get big chances here. It was bishop g5. It's the most accurate by far. Bishop g5, just keeping the bishop pair. If queen takes f4, bishop takes f4, looks very bad for black. His knight is still stuck on f8 with the pawn g6. There's no knight g6, the knight is not going anywhere. And he's just threatening something like rook c5, taking the pawn. And black is in a lot of trouble here. For example, c3, rook c5 stops the pawn call, queen takes, bishop takes, and white is having all the fun, definitely. So after queen takes f5, g takes f5, again, quite important moment. Gukesh played this rather quickly. He took on g7 instantly, and it was better to keep the bishop pair, because the two bishops, along with this passed pawn, give him better chances. The bishop goes back to e3. You can attack the pawn on the queen side, the a pawn. The bishop also stops the pawn in case it advances. It has an eye on the promotion square. By its changing, suddenly Ding got counterplay on the dark squares, and this maneuver got better. And white actually got kind of stuck with his worst bishop of the two. Worst because it's just it's just in the same color that, compared to its pawn on d5. So rook c5, Of course, what Gukesh saw was that he was capturing this pawn, but the thing is, if black can set up a blockade on dark squares, he may have a very tough position to crack, or it might even be completely possible to hold it. And Ding went knight g6, rook takes e4, knight e5, rook d4. Ding plays very well here. He plays a really nice maneuver with nice c6. It's not so much the attack on this pawn, but it's also the fact that the knight is going to e7, keeping an eye on d5, defending f5, and enabling some maneuvers like knight c8, knight d6. Now notice d6 would be an excellent blockading square for the knight. Imagine a knight on d6, the king going to f6, maybe even to e5, and black has a nice grip on the dark squares. And even though white is up a pawn and it's this passed pawn, if white can't push it forwards and doesn't have a plan to make progress here, black may well hold this endgame being down a pawn. So Gukesh doesn't play the best move here, but it was really hard to play the best move, which was rook d2. This is another beautiful subtlety that was missed by, well, by both players really, because if knight takes b2, there's d6. And it might look like this pawn will fall, and this is what was so hard. I mean, probably Gukesh thought, well, if I just lose the pawn on d6, I might even lose the game. There's a passer here on the a file. Thing is, he had this great move after d6, king f6 going after the pawn. There's bishop e2, and the problem is the king can't really get close enough. For example, if you go king e6, there's check, and if king e5, still trying to take, well, there's f4 check, king f6, bishop b5, the pawn is getting to d7, defended by the bishop, and that's an advantage to white, clearly. So rook d3, rook d2, black can still play to try to get a blockade on this pawn, but the idea was pretty effective. Knight takes b2, runs into d6, and this maneuver by the bishop is pretty strong. So Gukesh played a natural move anyway, rook f2, knight e7, b5, king f6, rook to d4. Both players are below 10 minutes. I mean, Ding only has 4 minutes to make the last couple of moves before the time control. h6, just putting a pawn on a square where may be easier to defend. King f1, and now this is quite an unfortunate spot for Ding, and again, accuracy was required. He needed to play knight c8, just get a knight to d6, completely blockade the position, and his drawing chances are great here. Most likely this is going to be a draw, but he probably wanted to force things a little bit, and he spent almost all his remaining 3 minutes on the last move before the time control. He played king e5, which is an unfortunate mistake that puts him again against the ropes after an incredible defense. I mean, he played a great defense, allowing g takes f5, getting the knight to activate itself at the cost of weakening his pawn structure. But the thing is, after rook h4, he's going to drop a pawn here. And white can press on forever. And the problem is, if rook d6, there's rook a4. This is a very nice nuance, a very cool rook swing, attacking the pawn. And if rook d7, again, rook a6, attacking the 2 pawns. And unfortunately for Ding, there's not much he can do against the loss of the h-pawn. If you play something like knight g6, h4, and h5 is coming, h6 is really in the crosshairs here. So Ding realized that he was losing the pawn, so he goes for activity, which is about right. Rook takes h6, knight c3, attacking the pawn b5. Gukesh plays very well here. He calculates excellently. He goes rook c6, attacking the knight and not allowing knight takes b5, because rook c5 check is a fork, and black can't interpose the rook because the bishop is also controlling that square. So that would result in losing the knight. So, okay, the pawn is indirectly defended, and Ding goes knight e4. And this is again a very important moment. And Gukesh plays a nice psychological move, but maybe not the best. He plays king e1, showing that he wants to keep the minor pieces. And it kind of makes sense because rook endgames tend to have, well, some tendency to be a draw. Probably not the case here, but still it makes sense to keep the bishop for some time. H4 was one of the best moves, and it was suggested everywhere. But I think this also works very well here, and one of the main points is that we can play rook c5 check and defend this pawn. So all the ideas of rook d5 attacking this pawn are gone now after bishop takes e4. Black has, well, two ways of playing this. He can take with the king or with the pawn. With the pawn is the most natural, and it may feel like black can get f5 in and get enough activity. He's still down a pawn, but he has a much more centralized king, more space, the pawns are advancing. But the thing is, this is never gonna happen. White could have played rook c5 here with check, and then fight for f5, for example, after something like king e6, still intending f5, then g4, disconnecting the 2 pawns. And then we could think of king g2, pushing the h pawn, and this should be a win. This should be a win for white. Not easy to pull the trigger, really. I mean, Gukesh can't be harshly criticized for this because, well, it's known that rook endgames are tricky, and active rooks and active kings can make up for a pawn deficit. This case, it seems like white has more than enough, and maybe by trading the bishop and making it more clear to some extent, it'll be easier to convert. At least that's what the game suggests. Also, if king takes, trying to activate the king, something like rook d2, some king f3, it's just really not enough. After rook c5, we keep an eye on the pawn on b5, so rook d5 is never a thing. And he can never come in here because we just take the pawn f5. We also have an eye on that one. And if f4, there's rook c4 check, and we just take with the rook. So our plan is going to be, well, to push the h pawn, bring the king, and black is most certainly struggling in this endgame. So honestly, I like the idea of taking on e4 and just sending this into a rook and pawn endgame, because I think in this case it should be winning. King e1 was challenging though. It's not an easy move to face, and I really love Ding's solution here. I don't know if it's the best move or not, but I just want to show what the idea behind it is. The thing is, we have to activate the rook, the king, and the knight, obviously, to make up for the missing pawn. So black is really looking for active counterplay. Anything else won't cut it. And if you play rook d3, which looks very natural right away, after bishop takes e4, f takes e4, rook c7, the problem is you're dropping another pawn. There's a fork here, an a7 and f7. So this can't be played directly. And even though the engine wanted something like rook d5, Ding played f6. A great move because it takes one of the pawns out of the crosshairs. So rook c7 won't be attacking both. And white doesn't have it easy here to make progress. Bishop takes, f takes e4. It's a bit different this time around. Bishop takes, f takes. If you go rook c5 check, then there is, well, no king d4 because of rook f5. You have to play king e6, and if g4 in this case, rook d3, and that's it. That's the problem. Suddenly black's rook is pretty active in this spot, and white has to get his rook kind of tied down to defending all those pawns. So very tough, very tough to notice the difference. But all of a sudden, taking on e4 doesn't look so great. So what was white to do in this position? Apparently the best was rook c8 and start and to start checking from behind. But there are so many options, and it doesn't look organic at all to go for this idea. I mean, normally white would play what Gukesh did. He played h4, but then Ding's idea shows itself in all its glory. Rook d3, and what's the difference this time around? What could be the difference? If bishop takes e4, then f takes e4, what has changed so much compared to the other line? Is that rook c7, there's rook b3. And rook takes a7, rook takes b5 ends up being, well, probably a draw, 3 versus 2, more active pieces by black. So compare that to just playing rook d3 right away. Rook d3, as in the other variation, without provoking, without having the pawn f6 first. After rook c7, you don't have time. You don't have time to play rook b3 because you have all your pawns under attack. That's the main point. If rook b3 is time around, white just takes and then takes the pawn a7. Not here though. After Ding played f6, h4, rook d3, now bishop takes, pawn takes. This one is guarded. So we're just going to exchange these two. And another very nice detail is that after king e2, only now black goes rook d5 and goes after the pawn. So what if black had done this before? Just before playing f6, let's say goes rook d5 here. There's bishop e2, not with the king on e2. With the king on e2, white doesn't have this resource. So f6 is a very tricky move. He really put Gukesh in a tough spot here. After rook d3, king e2, only now rook d5, attacking the pawn on b5. And then it's probably heading towards a draw again after this exchange. So what did Gukesh do after this? He played bishop d1. Has to be said that well, Ding really put him to a test here. If bishop e2, well, we just keep the rook active with rook b3, then we're looking for these checks. So Gukesh makes, well, sort of a mistake with bishop d1, but it's a very nice idea he has. But Ding again saw all the subtleties here. After f4, g takes f, king takes. I don't know if this is the case, but probably, oh yeah, he said, now that I remember, he said it during the press conference. What Gukesh missed is that rook c4 isn't as strong as it appeared at first. Because the thing is, the threat is very strong. Rook takes, king takes, bishop c2, pinning the rook. And with all the exchanges, then, of course, white is just making a queen there. And it's actually quite tough to defend against bishop c2, against f3, because of the pin on the knight on e4, he'll just lose the knight. But Ding, in this position, had this incredible rook h3, sidestepping all the threats, getting out of this diagonal. And if f3, rook h1 check is actually a draw. And it's even white who has to propose a repetition here with king e1, because king d3 gets checkmated in kind of a funny way. It's not a fitting end to such a great end, to such a great game, sorry. So king e1, rook h1, and it'll just be a draw for sure. So that rook h3 is what Ding had foreseen. Great defensive resource. And after bishop c2, rook d5, now we're inching closer to a draw. A lot of pawns are disappearing. White has the extra h pawn, but it's more or less under control. So from here, there's not really much hope of winning for white. He played rook c4, f5, rook b4, king f3, bishop d1 check, king g2, and some of these pawns are almost certain to fall. Rook b3, rook to e5, f4, and Gukesh tries to keep things going for a while, but for sure these pawns are very, very vulnerable. They're not going to stay on the board for long. Rook h7, h5, defending it with the bishop, knight f6, some pawns are coming off the board, knight g3, rook f8, rook to b7, attacking the pawn b5, bishop a4, king f3, and now he just proceeds to chase that pawn. f5, king f4, f6, knight e4, nice move, eyeing the pawn immediately. So, well, Gukesh tried to more or less confuse Ding. He played bishop b3, maybe threatening something like bishop d5. Oh, sorry, he played bishop c2, I mean, sorry. Trying to keep the pawn, well, on f6 instead of just pushing and being targeted immediately. But this time around doesn't even get to f7, so this is fizzling out to a draw pretty quickly. Rook d8, king e5, bishop to b3. The pawn is still not up for grabs because the knight is lost. But after knight f7, it's definitely a draw. The pawn is falling. If bishop takes f7, rook takes f7, it's kind of an elementary draw. And after rook d5 check, king takes f6, king d2, rook b6, it's obviously a draw. They just played it out to to the bitter end. Rook takes, bishop takes, knight d6, king b4, knight takes b5, just sacrificing the knight for the only remaining pawn. So of course white can't win with king and a bishop. So that was the end to the game. Amazing defense, so many subtle moves. Gukesh may regret losing some chances, but they were really tough. I mean, some of the moves were extremely hard to find for human being under time pressure. So we definitely have a sharper match now. Ding had the better chances in the last few games. I think in game 5 and 6 especially, he clearly pushed, and he may have had the opportunity to push for more. So I think this game is good for the match in general. It's also good for Ding because he notices that he can redefend a worse position in a very complex scenario where, well, I thought that he would have problems. I'm sure that many other people think thought that Ding would have a very hard time defending something like this, but he's really showing that he's up to par, and well, a very exciting match lies ahead clearly, and especially after this game. So we'll see what the second part of the match brings us. So thanks a lot for watching, and subscribe if you like the content. Please leave a like, and I'll see you in a future recap of this match. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.